In a small, close-knit neighborhood on the edge of a bustling city, there lived a man who was deeply respected by everyone around him. He wasn't famous or wealthy, but he had something far more valuable: respect. This man had served his country with pride. After returning from years of duty overseas where he faced unimaginable challenges, he came back home to rebuild his life. But his journey wasn't easy. The scars of war followed him, both mentally and physically. Yet, instead of letting those scars define him, he chose to channel his pain into helping others. He became a pillar of strength for his community. Every weekend, you could find him mentoring young kids at the local park, teaching them discipline and self-respect. He also volunteered at shelters, serving meals to people who were less fortunate. His presence brought comfort to many, especially to families who saw him as a role model. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a symbol of resilience and hope. One evening, after finishing his shift at work, this man was driving home. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was to get back to his family. Little did he know that this ordinary drive would turn into a nightmare. As he approached a quiet intersection, flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. A police officer was pulling him over. The man immediately pulled over, following every rule he knew. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel and waited patiently for the officer to approach. From outside, witnesses watched as the officer walked up to the car. What happened next is still debated, but one thing is certain. Moments later, gunshots rang out. The man slumped forward, blood pooling inside the car. Witnesses screamed. Unsure of what they had just witnessed, the officer claimed that the man had reached for something under his seat, making him fear for his life. But bystanders who recorded the scene on their phones captured something entirely different. In the shaky footage, the man can be seen keeping his hands raised, clearly showing no threat. Despite this, the officer fired multiple times. The sound of those shots echoed through the neighborhood, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who heard it. News of the shooting spread like wildfire. Neighbors gathered outside the house of the fallen man, lighting candles and sharing stories about how much he meant to them. They couldn't understand why someone who had given so much to his country and community had met such a tragic end. Anger and sadness filled the air as protests began to erupt. People marched through the streets, holding signs that demanded answers and justice. At the center of the storm stood the police department. They quickly released a statement defending the officer's actions, saying he acted according to protocol. However, questions lingered. Why did the dashcam footage from the officer's vehicle mysteriously malfunction? Why were the witness accounts so different from the official report? These unanswered questions only fueled the growing distrust between the community and law enforcement. As days turned into weeks, the case gained national attention. News outlets covered every detail, amplifying the voices of those calling for accountability. Civil rights organizations stepped in, offering support to the grieving family. Lawyers were hired, determined to uncover the truth behind what really happened that night. Meanwhile, the officer involved went on medical leave, claiming emotional distress. His supporters argued that he was simply doing his job, while critics accused him of using his position to avoid responsibility. Back in the neighborhood, emotions ran high. Friends and loved ones of the victim struggled to come to terms with their loss. For them, it wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about honoring the memory of a man who had touched so many lives. They vowed not to let his death be in vain, whether it was organizing marches, speaking to reporters, or reaching out to lawmakers. They refused to stay silent. This incident wasn't just another headline. It was a reflection of deeper issues plaguing society. Trust between communities and law enforcement had been fractured, and this tragedy exposed the cracks. People were angry, hurt, and scared. But amidst the chaos, there was also determination. Determination to seek the truth, to demand change, and to ensure that no other family would have to endure the same pain. And so, as the investigation unfolded, the nation watched closely. Everyone wondered, would the truth ever come to light? Could justice truly be served? Or would this become yet another story lost in the cycle of systemic failures? Only time would tell. but one thing was clear: the fight for accountability was far from over. As the days passed, the investigation into the shooting began to unfold. But instead of bringing clarity, it only raised more questions. The police department released their findings quickly, claiming that the officer had acted within the boundaries of his training. According to them, he followed protocol and made a split-second decision based on the perceived threat. However, the community wasn't buying it. Something about the story didn't add up. For starters, the dashcam footage from the officer's patrol car was mysteriously missing. It malfunctioned, they said, leaving no official record of what happened during the traffic stop. This claim felt suspicious to many, especially since bystanders had captured parts of the incident on their phones. Those shaky videos showed a very different picture, one where the driver appeared calm and compliant, even raising his hands in surrender moments before being shot. The family of the victim hired a lawyer to represent them. She was known for taking on tough cases involving civil rights and police misconduct. Her name wasn't important, but her reputation spoke volumes. People called her fearless because she never backed down, no matter how powerful the opponent. When she agreed to take this case, it gave the grieving family a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. The lawyer wasted no time digging into the details. She requested all available evidence, including witness statements, medical reports, and any internal documents related to the officer involved. What she uncovered shocked even her. The officer had a history, several complaints filed against him over the years, none of which led to serious consequences. Some accused him of using excessive force during arrests, while others claimed he was quick to escalate situations unnecessarily. Yet, each time, these complaints were brushed aside or quietly settled without much scrutiny. This pattern of behavior painted a troubling picture. To the lawyer, it seemed like the system had failed long before this tragic night. Instead of addressing these red flags, the department allowed the officer to stay on duty. Now, here they were, dealing with the aftermath of a life lost and a community torn apart. Meanwhile, the officer went on medical leave, citing emotional distress. His supporters rallied around him, describing him as a dedicated public servant who faced immense pressure every day. They argued that policing was a dangerous job, and officers often had to make impossible decisions in the heat of the moment. While some sympathized with this perspective, others found it hard to reconcile with the mounting evidence. Suggesting otherwise, the media played a big role in shaping public opinion. News outlets covered the case extensively, airing interviews with both sides. On one hand, there were heart-wrenching testimonials from the victim's loved ones. His wife spoke about how kind and gentle he was, how much he cared for his kids, and how he always tried to help others. Friends and neighbors echoed these sentiments, painting a vivid portrait of a man who gave everything he had to make the world better. On the other hand, the officer's colleagues defended him fiercely. They described him as a young man trying to do his best under difficult circumstances. One officer even broke down in tears during an interview, saying, "You don't know what it's like to face danger every single day. We're human too." These emotional appeals struck a chord with some viewers, creating a divide in how people viewed the case. As tensions escalated, protests continued to grow. Marches filled the streets, with chants demanding justice echoing through neighborhoods. Signs read, "Accountability now, and we deserve answers." People traveled from nearby towns to join the demonstrations, showing solidarity with the grieving family. At the same time, counter-protests emerged, with groups supporting law enforcement gathering outside police stations. The atmosphere grew increasingly charged, with emotions running high on both sides. Amidst all this chaos, the lawyer worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She knew the odds weren't in her favor. Cases like this rarely ended well for victims, families, especially when they were up against powerful institutions. But she also knew that giving up wasn't an option. For the sake of the victim's children, his wife, and everyone else affected by this tragedy, she had to fight. Her strategy focused on exposing inconsistencies in the official narrative. During her research, she discovered that the officer hadn't followed proper procedures during the traffic stop. For example, he failed to use de-escalation techniques, which are standard practice in situations like this. Instead, he resorted to lethal force almost immediately. Experts she consulted agreed that this response was disproportionate given the circumstances. With this information in hand, the lawyer prepared to file a lawsuit against the city and the police department. She argued that systemic failures allowed this tragedy to happen and sought accountability not just for the officer, but for the entire system that enabled him. Her goal wasn't just to win the case, it was to spark change, to ensure that no other family would have to endure the same pain, but winning wouldn't be easy. The legal battle ahead promised to be long and grueling. Both sides were gearing up for a courtroom showdown, knowing that the outcome would have far-reaching implications. Would the truth come out, or would the system protect itself once again? As preparations for the trial began, the nation watched closely. Conversations about policing, accountability, and justice dominated headlines. Social media buzzed with debates, petitions circulated online, and hashtags trended worldwide. Everyone wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted action. For the victim's family, the road ahead was daunting. Each day brought fresh reminders of their loss, yet they refused to give up. They held on to hope, clinging to the belief that their loved one's death could lead to meaningful change. And though the weight of grief pressed heavily on their shoulders, they stood tall, determined to honor his memory by fighting for justice, not just for him, but for everyone who deserved better. The day the trial began, the courtroom was packed to the brim. Every seat was taken. Family members, friends, activists, reporters, and even curious citizens filled the space. The air was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. On one side of the room sat the victim's family, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. They had been waiting for this moment for months, clinging to the hope that justice would finally be served. On the other side, supporters of the officer whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement as they discussed how tough it was to be in law enforcement. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood up. Her presence commanded respect, her expression unreadable as she took her seat. Once the formalities were over, the prosecution team rose to deliver their opening statement. The lawyer representing the victim's family stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She didn't just talk about laws or technicalities. She painted a picture of who the victim was: a man who loved his kids, cared deeply about his community, and worked hard every day to make life better for those around him. She showed photos of him mentoring young people at the park, smiling warmly as he handed out meals at the shelter and laughing with his family during happier times. This isn't just another case, she said firmly. This is about a human being whose life was cut short because someone chose not to see him as a person. Then came the video's grainy footage captured by witnesses on their phones. In slow motion, you could clearly see the victim raising his hands in surrender before collapsing behind the wheel. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the evidence sinking in. When it was the defense's turn, they presented a very different narrative. The officer took the stand, looking nervous but composed. He described the fear he felt during the traffic stop, emphasizing how split-second decisions are part of the job. "I thought my life was in danger," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "All I wanted was to go home safely to my family." His words struck a chord with some jurors, especially when he talked about the pressures of being an officer in today's world. His attorneys doubled down on this story, calling colleagues to testify on his behalf. These fellow officers praised his dedication and insisted he was a good man caught in a bad situation. They argued that policing is inherently risky and that officers must act quickly to protect themselves and others. To drive the point home, they introduced expert witnesses who claimed that reaching for something under the seat, even if it turned out to be harmless, could reasonably be perceived as a threat, but the prosecution wasn't done yet. When it was their turn to question the officer, things got intense. The victim's lawyer zeroed in on inconsistencies in his account. For instance, why did he say the victim reached for something when multiple videos showed otherwise? Why didn't he use verbal commands to de-escalate the situation first? Under pressure, the officer stumbled over his answers, admitting that he may have exaggerated certain details in his initial report. This admission sent ripples through the courtroom, leaving many wondering if the truth had finally surfaced. Expert witnesses called by the prosecution added fuel to the fire. A former police trainer testified that the number of shots fired far exceeded what was necessary, suggesting recklessness rather than self-defense. Another expert analyzed the dashcam malfunction, pointing out irregularities that hinted at tampering. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the defense's argument, forcing them to scramble for counterpoints. As the days dragged on, the trial became a battleground of perspectives. For the victim's family, each testimony brought a mix of emotions: anger at the injustices revealed, sadness at reliving the loss, and a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would prevail. Meanwhile, the officer's supporters clung to their belief that he was being unfairly judged, arguing that holding him accountable would discourage other officers from doing their jobs effectively. Outside the courthouse, the protests continued. Supporters of the victim held vigils nightly, lighting candles and sharing stories about how much he meant to them. Their chants echoed through the streets: "No justice, no peace." Across town, pro-police groups organized rallies insisting that officers needed more support, not less. The divide between the two sides grew wider with each passing day, reflecting the broader societal tensions surrounding issues of race, power, and accountability. Back inside the courtroom, the jury wrestled with conflicting narratives. Some leaned toward believing the officer's version of events, sympathizing with the challenges he faced. Others couldn't ignore the damning evidence against him, struggling to reconcile his actions with the image of a man who simply wanted to get home safely. It was clear that this decision wouldn't come easily. Finally, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the judge instructed the jury to begin their discussions. As they filed out of the room, the atmosphere shifted. The wait for a verdict felt endless, stretching into hours, then days. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, microphones ready. Protesters gathered once again, holding signs and praying for justice. Inside, the victim's family sat together, holding hands tightly, their eyes red from sleepless nights and endless tears. The tension in the courtroom was palpable when the jury finally returned. Everyone leaned forward, hearts pounding, as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. What happened next would leave an indelible mark not just on those directly involved, but on the entire nation watching closely. Would the system fail again, or would this be the moment where change truly began? No one knew for sure, but all eyes were fixed on the jury as they prepared to speak. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The jury re-entered the courtroom, their faces unreadable as they took their seats. Every eye in the room was glued to the foreperson, who stood holding a piece of paper that felt heavier than it looked. The judge asked the question that hung in the air like a storm cloud: "Has the jury reached a verdict?" With a deep breath, the foreperson nodded and began to read. As the words tumbled out, "Not guilty," the room erupted into chaos. Gasps filled the space, followed by sobs from the victim's family. His wife buried her face in her hands, shaking uncontrollably, while his mother let out a cry so raw it pierced through the noise. Friends and supporters hugged each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. For them, this verdict wasn't just a legal outcome, it was a confirmation of everything they feared about the justice system. It felt like yet another failure. Another reminder that some lives didn't seem to matter enough. On the other side, the officer's supporters exhaled in relief. Some even cheered quietly, though most remained silent, aware of the weight of the moment. The officer himself sat still, his expression blank, perhaps unsure whether to feel vindicated or burdened by the decision. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was explosive. Protesters chanted louder than ever, their voices carrying anger and despair. Signs reading "Justice Denied" and "We Won't Be Silent" waved in the wind as people marched through the streets. Social media lit up with hashtags calling for reform, and news outlets scrambled to cover the growing unrest. But just when it seemed like the story would end there, with disappointment and division, the judge did something unexpected. As the room slowly quieted, Judge Margaret Holloway leaned forward, her eyes scanning the courtroom. She didn't look angry or indifferent. Instead, she appeared deeply troubled, as if the weight of the case rested heavily on her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice carried authority, but also a sense of moral conviction that silenced everyone instantly. "This is not justice," she declared firmly, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "A man lost his life unnecessarily, and we cannot ignore the systemic failures that allowed this to happen." Her tone softened slightly as she continued, addressing the victim's family directly. "I know no verdict can bring him back, but I refuse to let this tragedy go unanswered." Then she made an announcement that stunned everyone in the room. Judge Holloway revealed her intention to file a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, urging federal intervention to investigate not only this specific incident but also broader issues within the police department. She called for transparency, accountability, and reforms that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. Her speech wasn't just a condemnation of the verdict, it was a call to action, a demand for change that resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Her bold move sparked immediate reactions. Supporters of the victim's family erupted in applause, many standing to show their gratitude. Even some jurors, visibly moved by her words, nodded in agreement. Outside, the protests shifted in tone. While anger remained, there was now a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, someone in power was listening. Activists praised the judge for taking a stand, calling her actions courageous and long overdue. Of course, not everyone agreed. Law enforcement unions were quick to criticize Judge Holloway, accusing her of overstepping her role and undermining the integrity of the judicial process. They argued that officers already faced immense pressure and scrutiny, and that second-guessing their decisions would make policing even more difficult. Some media outlets highlighted these opposing views, framing the debate as a clash between public safety and civil rights. Despite the backlash, Judge Holloway's decision became a turning point. Her willingness to challenge the status quo inspired others to speak up. Lawmakers started drafting legislation aimed at increasing accountability in law enforcement. Community leaders organized town hall meetings to discuss how to rebuild trust between residents and police. Even ordinary citizens who might have otherwise stayed silent joined conversations about what kind of society they wanted to live in. For the victim's family, the fight was far from over. Though the verdict left them heartbroken, they found strength in the judge's words and the renewed energy surrounding their cause. With the help of their lawyer, they launched a foundation dedicated to supporting families affected by similar tragedies. The foundation focused on 3 key areas: providing resources for victims' loved ones, advocating for policy changes, and educating communities about their rights. It was their way of ensuring that his memory lived on, not as a statistic or a headline, but as a catalyst for meaningful change. They also partnered with local organizations to address the root causes of violence and inequality. By working together, they hoped to create a future where no one else would have to endure the pain they felt. Their efforts weren't easy. There were setbacks, criticisms, and moments of doubt, but they refused to give up. Each step forward, no matter how small, brought them closer to the justice they sought. As weeks turned into months, the impact of the case continued to ripple outward. Cities across the country began implementing new policies, such as requiring body cameras for all officers and establishing independent oversight boards to review misconduct complaints. Training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, aiming to reduce unnecessary confrontations. While progress was slow, it was undeniable, a sign that the voices demanding change were finally being heard. Back in the neighborhood where the tragedy occurred, things slowly started to shift. Residents noticed a greater effort from local authorities to engage with the community. Officers attended block parties and school events, trying to build relationships rather than enforce fear. Trust wouldn't return overnight, but these small gestures offered a glimpse of what was possible when people worked toward understanding instead of division. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, the legacy of the victim's story grew stronger. With time, he may have been taken too soon, but his life and the way he lived it continued to inspire others. Through the pain and struggle, his family found purpose, channeling their grief into action. And though the verdict had stung, Judge Holloway's courage reminded them that justice isn't always served in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins with a single voice refusing to stay silent. As the sun set over the city, casting golden light. On the streets where protests once roared, the community came together again. This time, it wasn't out of anger or despair, it was out of hope. Hope that the lessons learned from this tragedy would lead to a better tomorrow. Hope that the sacrifices made wouldn't be forgotten. And hope that someday true justice would prevail for everyone. Months turned into years, but the memory of the man who was taken too soon never faded. His story became more than just a tragic headline. It evolved into a symbol of resilience and a rallying cry for change. The foundation created in his honor grew beyond anyone's expectations, becoming a beacon of hope for families who had faced similar losses. It wasn't just about seeking justice anymore. It was about rebuilding lives, fostering understanding, and creating a world where tragedies like this wouldn't happen again. The foundation's work began at the grassroots level. They hosted workshops in schools, teaching kids how to interact with law enforcement safely, while also empowering them to speak up if they witnessed wrongdoing. For adults, they organized forums where community members could sit down with officers not as adversaries, but as neighbors trying to understand each other better. These conversations weren't always easy. There were moments of tension, frustration, and even anger. But over time, something remarkable happened. Trust started to form. People realized that behind the badges were human beings with their own fears and hopes. And officers learned that the people they served weren't faceless statistics. They were parents, children, friends, and neighbors. One of the Foundation's biggest achievements was pushing for policy changes. Thanks to their relentless advocacy, lawmakers passed sweeping reforms aimed at increasing transparency within police departments. Body cameras became mandatory nationwide, ensuring that every interaction between officers and citizens was recorded. Independent oversight boards gained real power, giving communities a voice in holding law enforcement accountable. Training programs shifted focus, emphasizing de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Officers were taught not only how to protect themselves, but also how to serve with compassion and respect. These changes didn't erase the pain of the past, but they offered a sense of closure to those who had fought so hard for them. The victims' wife often spoke at events, sharing her journey from grief to purpose. She talked about how losing her partner had shattered her world, but how honoring his legacy gave her strength. Her speeches resonated deeply because she didn't sugarcoat anything. She acknowledged the anger, the sleepless nights, and the days when getting out of bed felt impossible. Yet she also spoke about the importance of channeling that pain into action. He lived to help others, she would say, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. And now we carry that mission forward. Her words inspired countless others to join the movement. Young activists took to social media, using their platforms to amplify marginalized voices and demand accountability. Artists painted murals dedicated to victims of police violence, turning city walls into memorials that couldn't be ignored. Musicians wrote songs that captured the raw emotions of loss and longing for justice. Even businesses got involved, donating funds to support reform efforts and sponsoring educational initiatives. What started as one family's fight transformed into a collective push for progress. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt in the hearts of ordinary people. Conversations about race, inequality, and policing became part of everyday life. Neighbors who once avoided discussing these topics found themselves sitting together at kitchen tables, sharing stories and listening to perspectives different from their own. Parents taught their children the value of empathy and standing up for what's right. Teachers incorporated lessons on civil rights and systemic injustice into their curriculums, ensuring that future generations wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. Years later, the community gathered for a special ceremony. A statue had been erected in the park where the victim used to mentor young people. It depicted him smiling warmly, one hand extended as if inviting others to join him in making the world a better place. At the unveiling, his mother spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't just a monument," she said. "It's a reminder of what he stood for and what we must continue to stand for." As the crowd applauded, you could see the pride in their eyes. This wasn't just a tribute to one man. It was a testament to the power of unity and perseverance. Of course, challenges remained. Not everyone embraced the changes willingly. Some officers resisted new policies, arguing that they made their jobs harder. Certain politicians tried to roll back reforms, claiming they hampered public safety. And there were still moments when tensions flared between communities and law enforcement. But the difference now was that people refused to stay silent. Every setback sparked renewed determination. Every obstacle became an opportunity to push harder, dig deeper, and keep moving forward. For the victim's family, healing was a lifelong process. The void he left behind could never truly be filled, but they found solace in knowing that his death had sparked meaningful change. His children grew up hearing stories about their father not just as a hero, but as a person who loved fiercely and lived selflessly. They carried his values with them, striving to make him proud in everything they did. As the sun set on the day of the statue unveiling, the park buzzed with laughter and music. Kids played tag near the monument, oblivious to its significance, but embodying the hope it represented. Older folks sat on benches, reminiscing about how far they'd come. And somewhere in the distance, a choir sang a song of peace, a melody that echoed through the neighborhood and lingered long after the event ended. In the end, this story wasn't just about tragedy or triumph. It was about humanity, the good, the bad, and the potential for growth. It showed that even in the darkest moments, light can emerge if people refuse to give up. It proved that one life, no matter how ordinary it may seem, has the power to inspire extraordinary change. And it reminded everyone that justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoers, it's about creating a world where wrongs are less likely to happen in the first place. So, as the stars lit up the night sky, the community stood together, united by a shared vision of a brighter future. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but they also knew they had the strength to keep walking it. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in courtrooms or legislatures, they're won in the hearts and minds of those who dare to believe in a better tomorrow.